So let's talk about the mindset that we need. And to do that, I first want to tell a story of the modern world as this fully entangled suite of ecological and social crises. That's the landscape that we now inhabit. And as Don said, I have a list of videos, a number of videos. If you want real details on some of these crises, which I'm just going to summarize for you right now so we can get to the mindset, go to his website, and there are links to videos on climate change and on the Anthropocene. But let me just say, here is that suite of ecological and social crises. We've got intense anthropogenic climate disruption of the entire planetary climate system. We have a life support system, the biosphere, in collapse. We have dismal social outcomes around the world. And the human systems, our human civilization that is creating all of these outcomes, is itself enormously unsustainable. So let me talk about these just in brief. And as I said, there's a whole list of videos you can watch on these in detail, but let's just start with climate. The summary is this: our carbon emissions are elevated more than 50% over what they have been in carbon levels in the atmosphere, elevated over 50% over what they have been over the last 12,000 years, to a level of 317 parts per million. If you know what carbon dioxide is and what the level should be, then that's fine. But what you need to know is that it's rising dramatically and still climbing. This is important because this is a greenhouse gas. And greenhouse gases, because of their molecular structures, trap energy leaving the Earth system in the form of light, infrared light mostly, and convert that energy into thermal energy in the atmosphere. They warm us up. We have identified 1.5 degrees Celsius of global average warming as a danger line, beyond which the impacts to human civilization, and the human ecosystem that envelops us begin to rise dramatically. We have currently warmed about 1.2 degrees Celsius. We will burn up the budget of carbon that we have, that will take us to 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years, barring massive changes to the way that we behave. We will burn up our budget, taking us to 2 degrees Celsius of global average warming in the next 15 years. And this is a critical threshold because, for example, marine biologists tell us that should we reach roughly 2 degrees Celsius of warming, we can expect to lose all of the ocean's coral reef systems. This is home to 25% of the ocean's biodiversity, feeding somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people on the planet. And we are coming very close to tipping points that then push us into a climate regime that makes reversing course almost impossible. And so we literally exist in a state of climate emergency. Where I'm using that term specifically, an emergency is a situation that requires an immediate response to prevent catastrophic outcomes. The next decade is the most important any of us will ever live through in trying to mitigate this and halt this progression. But it doesn't end with the climate system. It turns out we're also doing enormous damage to the living systems on the planet, Earth's biosphere. And this is largely not from climate change. A couple of key results from the enormous body of science that studies our impacts on the living world. In the last 50 years, human beings have wiped out 70% of the living creatures on this planet. This is the populations. In the last 50 years, human beings have wiped out 70% of the living creatures on the planet. We have elevated the extinction rate by a factor of roughly 1,000 times above that of the background extinction rate. We are losing now somewhere between 50 and 200 species every single day. 1 million species are at risk this century. And the cause of this, as I mentioned, is primarily not climate change. About 15% of this impact is coming from climate change, the ecologists tell us. The other 85% from habitat destruction resulting from hyper-extraction and hyper-pollution of the natural world. So fix climate change tomorrow. And this biodiversity collapse continues essentially unabated. So that's the climate system and the living system. How are the outcomes for the people that are enveloped by these systems? 3 billion to up to 4 billion people on the planet today exist in some form of critical human deprivation. 70 million people currently have been forcibly displaced from their homes due to environmental and social disruptions. Think of the civil war, for example, in the Ukraine, the civil war in Syria, or the ongoing war in Ukraine as just two examples. 40 million people today exist in some form of human slavery. That's more people in bondage than at any time, any other time in human history today in 2022. And we exist in a state, most of all, of hyper inequity. Think of two people in the United States, two single individuals controlling as much wealth as the poorest 200 million. And think of 24 people across the world controlling as much wealth as the poorest 4 billion people. And finally, our civilization itself exists in a state of extreme unsustainability. The current human civilizational metabolism requires 1.7 planets to sustain it as it is today. This is the material that we take in, use to produce the things that we produce, and then absorb the wastes that we create. We are in 170% overshoot of our resource base. And our plan on purpose through growth is to be at more than 300% overshoot of our resource base within 2 decades and 600% overshoot within 4 decades. And the science of these systems, in particular complex physical natural systems, tells us that we are not going to get anywhere close to 600% overshoot before wheels begin to come off the cart. In fact, it's unlikely we get to 3 planets. So we can put a cap on the extreme unsustainability of our human civilizational systems at, call it 1 to 4 decades. So the bad news is these systems are creating enormous ecological and social damage. The good news is those systems are most definitely going away. The bad news is our plan for those systems to go away is to crash out of them in an uncontrolled fashion, which of course brings with it enormous human and non-human suffering. So there's the state of our modern world today. These fully entangled ecological and social crises. And it has led one scientist, Kevin Anderson, quite a famous climate scientist and one of the world's preeminent carbon systems modelers in the UK, to make this statement, which I would say is the mainstream scientific interpretation of this information: there are no non-radical futures ahead of us. We either plan for radical transformation, and I greatly appreciated your use of that word, Dr. Workspa. We must transform the systems that we currently rely upon radically, or those systems will simply go away on their own, again leaving us with a very radical, different future.